How's it going, everybody? Today we're going to be talking about how to keep the scope of your indie game grounded in reality and achievable when you're getting started in game development. Today's video topic actually comes from a question in the comments on one of my previous videos, and I plan to answer this question taking a look at 5 tips based on my failures and victories in my career in game development. You can watch video after video and they'll all tell you the exact same thing. Don't bite off more than you can chew. Start small, make small projects, learn from your mistakes, and keep growing your projects over time. This is good advice and I take it to heart, but you really have to be kind of specific in how you go about handling this. Tip number 1 is to avoid large narrative-based games. My first game was called The Letter. It was a small game. I kept the scope small, just like every other advice video tells you to do. It only had just a few scenes, but it was a story-based game, and when people read the description of that game, they were expecting it to be something much greater than it was. And even though they should have realized from the screenshots, the description, and the price of the game only being $1.99, that they shouldn't have expected a whole lot there. It was a small, basically student project, but by looking at it and it's supposed to be a horror narrative game, people were expecting for it to be huge. So when you're first starting out, it's much easier to tackle arcade-based games and things of that nature, level-based games, where there isn't a huge story, where people aren't expecting it to be The Last of Us or an Uncharted experience from an indie developer. Tip number 2 is to focus on replayability. This was a huge issue with my first game, The Letter. It had just a few scenes, it was one narrative experience, and when you played it and you got to the end, you saw all that there was to do, and the game is over, and then you just don't play it again. This also left people with a bad taste in their mouth because it was so short and it ended so quickly, they were expecting more. This is an issue that I tackled in my next game, which is called Maze. But more specifically, I added in special modes into this game to make it a little bit more replayable than the last by adding things like an arcade mode and multiplayer. For your very first game, multiplayer might be a big task to try to accomplish. So something like an arcade mode that's high score based is something that's easier to focus on. You're giving players more value out of a single level than you would if it was just the level by itself. So they can keep returning to the same content, so it's easier for you to create, but it provides them with more fun. Replayability can be achieved in a couple of different ways, but the main for me is high scores, time trials, and randomness. Time trials keeps your players coming back, trying to best their own times. High scores keeps your players coming back to try to best their own scores, and for each of these, they can be not only a competition against themselves, but they can be shared with other players and turned into a competition. And randomness gives players a new experience every single time they play a particular level. The best example in my career to showcase these features is my title called Annihilation. Annihilation is a small top-down survival shooter. It's all pixel-based. The game is actually pretty small in scope, but it's really replayable because it features a lot of randomness with constraints, and it also features high scores. The key to randomness is constraining it so some players won't have an experience that's just absolutely terrible compared to other players. In Annihilation, for instance, there are multiple ways that creatures can spawn. They can all spawn in different rows, and each time, each wave, there's a set number that you have to fight that's the exact same every single time, but they spawn in different orders and in different places every single time. So the difficulty is going to be maintained about the same level each time you play. That way, each of the levels is not, one time it's not broken and really hard and one time it's super easy. It's about the same every single time, but it never appears in the exact same order, so it's always a little bit of a different experience. Talking about Annihilation leads me right into my next tip. Tip number 3 is to keep your scene count low. When you're first starting out and you haven't honed your skills or refined your process, creating art can take a long time. Games with a ton of scenes and varying environments make it really easy to accidentally employ feature creep, which is the main thing you're trying to avoid by keeping your scope small. Feature creep is basically when you get all these ideas, and it happens all the time as a game designer, to where like you have an original idea, set project, and you know what you're going to do for your game, but when you're getting close to finishing, you have all these ideas and you want to add new features and new things to the game, and inevitably it ends up delaying your game forever, and you try to put too many things in and it ends up being really bad or just not a very polished project. When you're just learning and starting out and trying to get experience and feel how level design works and see what player feedback is, designing just a couple levels, ones that have high scores and ones that are really replayable, that type of project is much easier for you to complete, actually finish the game, learn something, and then attempt a bigger project instead of just trying to create a giant RPG and then never finishing and then quitting game development forever. Tip number 4 is going to bounce right off of that last point, and it's to focus on one core mechanic while limiting all the other mechanics in the game. By doing this, you will effectively scope off and destroy feature creep. There's nothing wrong with having more than one core mechanic in a game, but especially when you've been working in game development for a while. But when you're first getting started, trying to do a ton of different things, making a ton of different items, giving the player a ton of different abilities, you're really going to spread your design prowess thin, and your game isn't going to be really focused on what makes your character different and what makes your game different. It's a really good practice just to focus on one thing, make a few scenes, make the designs really good, give people an enjoyable experience that they're going to want to replay and keep coming back to. And from then, you'll be able to learn and grow that into larger projects in the future. My final tip is to design and price accordingly. Before you even start your project, you need to be thinking about those first 4 tips and culminate them all into a single design, write it all down, plan it all out, and don't go past it for your first project. As for price, there's nothing wrong with making a low-priced game, especially when you're purposely trying to learn and keep the scope of your game small. As you grow and as you learn and make more games, and each one they get a little bit bigger, you can move up your price, and as you increase in your skills and your quality, you can change the price of your games. This is something that I've done specifically with my games. When I was first starting, most of my games were only cost about $1.99. As I got a little bit bigger and started making games with more replayability and more levels, I started charging $2.99, and from there I moved into the $4.99 realm. And then after that, a few years later, I was able to start selling games between $5.99 and $9.99. Not only is the financial result of creating larger and bigger games better, I've also received better feedback on my more recent games, which I would not have been able to do if I started off super huge in the very beginning. Sure, I made some mistakes and I learned from those and changed them throughout the years, but if I would have started with a giant game and had no idea what I was doing and tried to make a giant game like the letter times 10 and then tried to sell that for more, it would have been an absolute failure. No one would have tried the game and I would have quit game development forever. But because I kept the scope small, I kept the price accordingly, lots of people tried it, they hated it, but then I was able to learn, grow, change, evolve, focus, and make better games. If you're just starting out in game development, I hope these tips helped you. If you got any value from any of these tips at all, please be sure to hit the like button. It helps out the channel a ton. If you're new to the channel and this is your first video that you're watching, my name is Eli and I run an indie game development studio called TreeFall Studios. As I mentioned in the video, I've released lots of commercial projects from the PC to the Wii U to the PS4. I make videos showcasing my games, and I also make videos on helping you get started in game development. So if you find that interesting, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an upload. It really helps out the channel. Before I go, I need to give a huge shout out to everyone who supports TreeFall Studios on patreon.com, and I need to give a personal shout out to PLP, Carmen Red, LV, Overhyped Gamer, and Zach Ware. Thank you for what you do for TreeFall Studios on patreon.com. If you're interested in checking out the Patreon page, check out the links in the description below. Without further ado, I'll catch you guys in the next video.